So let me add a bit of background information to Peter's fine introduction. So Professor Schelling was born in Oakland, California. He got his BA in economics from Berkeley in 1944 and his PhD in economics from Harvard in 1951. Then he was a junior fellow at the prestigious Society of Fellows with Chomsky and these kind of people have been there. And from this point on, he has also had many major academic and political appointments. He helped, for example, with the Marshall Plan. He joined the White House staff in the 1950s and has over the years and under several different presidents been chairman and member of many important committees. Arms control and the climate have been two of the many topics Professor Schelling has dealt with. His academic appointments include Yale, later Harvard, and today University of Maryland. And as Peter mentioned, he of course got the Nobel Prize in 2005 together with Robert Aumann. Of his works, the two perhaps best known are The Strategy of Conflict from 1960 and The Micromotives and Macrobehavior from 1978. But he has also written many other monographs and many essays that are in several nice collections that you should look at. Now, I'm extra happy to do this interview because I had the pleasure of interviewing Professor Schelling in 1988. And it's great for me to meet him again 30 years later and a Nobel Prize later. And I have prepared some questions for you. So the two main themes I would like to pursue today in our conversation are the following. One is the topics and subjects that you have worked on. And the second is the very special way in which you have approached and analyzed these topics and subjects. So I think that these two themes are of interest to the audience, which most people here have read and admire your work very deeply. But there's also a deeper reason for selecting just these two themes. And that is that I think that we all want to learn a bit from you, both when it comes to what topics to study, but also how to theorize them, how to approach them. So let me start with the second topic, the theorizing. So the theorizing is what comes before the theory, or what's written down in the book or the article. So while the reader has access to the article or the book, he or she does not have access, of course, to the thinking that comes before the text, which is perhaps the most interesting part to know. So my first question to Professor Schelling is the following. Does there exist a special Schelling approach to theorizing, or perhaps better, a certain style of theorizing that you usually engaged in? And in that case, how would you describe this? I mean, there is a description when you got the Nobel Prize, but I think actually your method is a little bit different and much broader, but the word is yours.
First, let me say how much I appreciate the opportunity to be here. The last time I was here, my wife and I were here, we were within about 10 days of the shortest day of the year. And at this time, we're within about 10 days of the longest day of the year. And we can tell the difference, really. One thing I should probably say, Peter Hedstrom quoted the Nobel Selection Committee explaining I had enhanced our understanding of conflict and cooperation through game theory analysis. They then cited two essays of mine that were to demonstrate what they had in mind. And those two essays I published before I knew any game theory. I learned game theory in 1957 from a book by Duncan Luce and Howard Rafa called Games and Decisions. I spent about 200 or 300 hours studying it, and it allowed me to formalize a lot of the things I was thinking about in game theoretical terminology, so that it helped me to learn formal game theory, helped me to straighten out my thoughts, helped me to express myself sometimes, and especially for those who expected game theory, I could display a little bit of game theory to get my point across. But Richard asked whether there was anything special about my thinking, and I've tried to reflect back on what motivated especially most of the work in my book, The Strategy of Conflict, in which the second chapter was called An Essay on Bargaining. And the way I got to that subject was, as Richard mentioned, I spent 2 years in Europe with the Marshall Plan, 1 year in Copenhagen and a year at the central office in Paris, spending all of my Paris time negotiating to establish something called the European Payments Union. Then I went to Washington. What happened was that the head of the Paris office of the Marshall Plan, Avril Harriman, with the rank of ambassador, was called back to Washington to be the White House National Security or Foreign Affairs Advisor to President Harry Truman. And he took my boss, Lincoln Gordon, with him to the White House. And I was left behind to finish negotiating the European Payments Union. And along about October or November, my former boss, who was now in the White House, wrote me and said he'd arranged for me to join the staff of the White House. So I went to Washington and spent a year, essentially a White House representative on various State Department committees and things. Then the legal basis of the Marshall Plan shifted from economic cooperation to what was called mutual security, basically supporting the development of NATO and NATO armed forces in Europe. And there again, I spent most of my time in negotiating, not face-to-face negotiating, but writing out cablegrams to send off to Brussels or Paris or Bonn or some such place. And all of this time, I was sort of studying, trying to figure out what does negotiation consist of? How do you bargain? How do you establish a position? And I was very much struck with the fact that the U.S. team spent more than a year trying to persuade the European recipients of Marshall Plan funds, persuade them that they crucially needed a better intra-European payment system than they had. At that time, virtually all trade between the West European nations was on a purely bilateral basis, and the trade had to be balanced, so that if, say, Denmark traded with Greece or Italy, the trade had to be balanced bilaterally, Denmark to Greece, Denmark to Italy, and so forth. And we wanted to set up something more like a clearinghouse for currencies, where you could essentially bank the currency of Greece or Italy and spend it in Germany or Belgium or Norway. But this was going to require a capital contribution estimated at $300 million. And that was going to be taken out of the annual appropriation for Marshall Plan aid to West European nations. And the West European nations, countries like Sweden, preferred that the $300 million be available to be distributed among the nations rather than banked in a European Payments Union. And we were getting nowhere persuading the countries that this would be a good idea. But they simply declined to take seriously the need to negotiate a European Payments Union. And then somebody back home in Washington got a very clever idea. He persuaded the Congress that in appropriating the funds for the second year of the Marshall Plan, $300 million be specifically set aside to be available solely for the purpose of endowing an institution for intra-European payments. And once the Congress did that, it was illegal to use the funds for anything else, at which point all the West European countries chipped in, took it seriously, and within a month we had a European Payments Union. And I thought that was a very clever move on the part of the Home Office in Washington to persuade the Congress that we couldn't possibly hold out the 300 million against the demands of all the West European countries to distribute it as aid on top of the aid they were otherwise going to get out of this annual appropriation. But once it was legally unavailable for anything else, that settled it. And I thought, I learned something there. Something about how do you establish a negotiating position and make it believable, make it stick. And one way is to make sure that the funds are simply not available for anything else but the purpose you were trying to negotiate. And that led me to this notion, how does one commit to a position? How does one establish a negotiating position without it being thought that if the negotiating partner just holds out a little longer, one will concede, one will abandon the position one has taken. And it occurred to me, that's a little like, how do you make a promise that is believable? How do you make a threat that is believable? And that, when I finished all of this Washington business in 1953 and went to Yale University, I decided that I would make bargaining theory my research interest. And then I began wondering, how do you study bargaining? And I decided you find bargaining wherever it exists. And I found that I could study ancient history and learn a lot about bargaining. I could read Herodotus and Thucydides and Xenophon and even Julius Caesar and learn a lot about bargaining and negotiation. I found that I could read a lot of fiction, including crime fiction. And there's a lot of interesting kinds of criminal bargaining. Extortionists negotiate with their victims on how much they're going to get paid for protection, where protection meant you're protected from us. You have to pay us to be protected from us, because if you're a restaurant and I want you to pay me $100 a week, I can threaten, I'll make a restaurant just so disagreeable that nobody will ever attend it. I can throw a stink bomb into the place and everybody will have to evacuate, and pretty soon nobody will come back to eat here because they know that if they do, I'll throw a stink bomb into the restaurant and they'll have to evacuate. And then I noticed that a lot of the extortionists in dealing with bars and restaurants didn't ask for cash. They insisted that you sign a contract, we deliver all of your beer and liquor, or we do all of your linen services, we'll do your tablecloths and your napkins and so forth, but we'll do it at exorbitant prices. And I thought to myself, there must be some reason why they would rather sell you beer at a high price than take your cash. And it occurred to me, well, obviously, one thing you should make sure of if you're going to extract money from a restaurateur, be sure that what he pays you is tax deductible. There's no sense in making him lose more than you gain if you can arrange that he pays a monopoly price for beer and linen services. That's all tax deductible. I also thought it helps if every restaurant knows that all of its competitors are paying the same high monopoly price for beer or linen service, because then we all know that we can pass the price along to the customer and it's not going to come out of our profits except part of it. And I read a lot of espionage stories. John le Carré used to spend a lot of time discussing in his novels, if the West has a Soviet spy and the East has an American spy, and they want to trade, how do you trade? How do you make sure that when it's time to deliver the spy, they bring forth the spy they agreed to trade with you? And this even comes up nowadays when we think about nuclear terrorism. It was believed 30 years ago that there was lots of loose nuclear material suitable for nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, that could be stolen from various laboratories in different republics of the Soviet Union, and that this could all find its way into the weapon laboratories of terrorist organizations. In fact, way back in 1979, I went to a conference in Israel on terrorism, organized by Benjamin Netanyahu, who's now the Prime Minister of Israel. And my topic was nuclear terrorism, and I published an article that said sometime in the 1980s, a nuclear bomb will be in the hands of a non-state organization of some kind, if not in the 1980s, then in the 1990s. Well, after more than 30 or 35 years, there's no known instance of any terrorist organization having produced any kind of a nuclear weapon. And then that led me to wonder, if you have nuclear materials that is worth $10,000 or $100,000 to a terrorist who has in mind building a nuclear weapon, how do you find that terrorist? If you're in Kazakhstan and the only language you speak is Kazakhstan, how do you know where to go to find a Saudi Arab or an Iranian or an Iraqi who's in the market for weapons-grade nuclear materials? How do you get there? How do you locate them? How do you discuss it? And since my customer is likely somebody who's willing to kill 100,000 people, why would he bother to pay me once I have the material? Why not just kill me? And this sort of activity intrigued me. And so I would say that my research method, Richard, was to look at bargaining any place I could find it. And in some ways, the more dramatic the bargaining, the more likely it was to betray some interesting principles. But I also have to confess that at the time I was doing that work, I had 4 small children. And learning how to negotiate with a 10-year-old or even how to train a dog was full of good examples of bargaining tactics.
So when I asked you about your method or approach, you went back to strategy of conflict, but something must have happened in your mind before that time. I mean, already as a boy, I mean, you were mentioning reading later all these spy stories and so on and so forth, but already as a young person, did you notice that your mind was sort of like ticking in some direction or picking up certain things? Or because if I had had your experience, I mean, I wouldn't have been able to come up with your analysis. So, you know.
How do you know that?
Well, I just assume so.
No, I don't remember that as a boy I was particularly theoretically interested in any of this bargaining stuff. No, I think I really got curious in it when I was spending so much time. I remember at one point the State Department wanted us to continue to give I think, $15 million worth of aid to the Netherlands. And I was in this, chaired this White House committee. We were like the Budget Bureau for foreign aid. And my team decided the Netherlands didn't really need the $15 million. And we proposed 0. And the State Department said, no, you can't do that. That will offend the Dutch. That will be denying Marshall Plan aid for the first time to a recipient country. It will essentially spoil a close relationship between Netherlands and the United States, a diplomatic relationship. And my team and I proposed as follows. We said, why don't you, the State Department, get in touch with the U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands and tell him to organize a congratulatory event to congratulate the Dutch on being the first among all of the Marshall Plan recipient countries to have overcome its balance of payments problem and have eliminated its need for external support. So the State Department wrote to our ambassador, who thought it was a good idea, and he called in the foreign minister and talked it over, and in the end they had a great celebration. The first Marshall Plan country to be out of need. And things like that just struck me as what I wanted to write about when I got off to Yale University. But then it took me several years to get to where I could write something. And it's interesting. I first decided this would be a book. And I ended up with about 275 pages, manuscript pages. And decided if it's a book, a few thousand people will read it. If I could condense it into an article, thousands may read it. So I spent 3 months doing nothing but converting 275 pages into about 75 manuscript pages, which would be about 30 printed, published pages. And I discovered that if I worked at it, I could say everything that I had already said in 275 pages in about 75 pages. And it worked. I got a lot more attention than if it had been a book to begin with.
Yeah, on a more abstract level, I mean, do you think that one should start with observations, or one start with theory, or how would you?
Well, I think I started with observations. And it was puzzling over the observations. What is there about the particular event or phenomenon that I was looking at? What is it that I can generalize? Did I learn something here that will help me get along with my children? Did I learn something here that would help me become a better extortionist if I wanted to get in the kidnapping business or something like that? So that I think mostly it was observing puzzling things and trying to figure out what's behind the puzzle. Is there a principle here that I can identify and then see it in action in many different contexts? Criminal extortion, police negotiations, diplomacy, labor management negotiations, things of that sort. Several examples. For example, I had been something of a student of labor economics and labor management negotiations. And I was struck with the fact that in the United States, most of the big unions were national or so-called international, Canadian-American, which made them international. And most of the big unions developed what they called strike insurance, an understanding that if a local, say, of the United Electrical Workers was going on strike against a particular corporation, they could claim partial reimbursement from all the other locals that would chip in, so that these people on strike who had no wages could collect about 80% of what would have been their wages in contributions from other unions from the same international. And that was thought of as a way to keep families from going hungry while the man was on strike. Well, it turned out, quite naturally, that if they could collect about 80% of what their wages would have been, they were in no great desperation to get back to work. And that meant that it was clear that they could hold out longer than management could hold out, because the strike was not costing them more than a small percentage of their regular wages. So almost inadvertently, something that hadn't occurred to them was a very clever negotiating device, namely, have a claim on the other unions so that the strike doesn't cost us more than a modest fraction of our wages. And eventually that spread and became what I would call a very powerful bargaining technique. But it wasn't intended that way. They only discovered afterwards that this put them in a very strong position vis-a-vis management. So I found things like that, and every time I found one, I tried to figure, does this have some relationship? Does it suggest something about the way my children deal with me? I remember once I overheard two of my children, one saying, "We better not do this. It'll make Daddy very mad." And the other child I overheard saying, "Oh, Daddy's mad already. Let's go ahead." And things like that I collected.